Hey everyone, my name is Sikta. I'm a doctor based in Australia, and today we're going to be talking about the difference between the Australian and Canadian healthcare system, specifically specialty programs. So there's someone on YouTube that asked me about the differences between healthcare systems in the two countries, but also more specifically what made me choose Australia in comparison to Canada. So I just want to share a bit of insight about the second question in terms of what specifically made me move to Australia when I was in Canada already. And so I always wanted to be a doctor, and it was medicine or nothing for me, and there was no plan B for me. So I really loved medicine. I really wanted to enter it, and I knew that I was going to do whatever it takes to get in. And during my final year of undergrad in Canada, I was basically on a wait list for med school in Canada, but I had my acceptance in Australia. And I unfortunately didn't get into med school in Canada, but I had my Australian acceptance offer. So I just made the decision to take the plunge and actually start med school because I really wanted to be a doctor instead of play the waiting game and apply for an eternity and do research that wasn't really my interest in Canada. So that's sort of what drew me to Australia and led to me being in Australia. But that being said, I'm not going to move back to Canada. I love Australia. I love the lifestyle I have over here. I love the opportunities I have as a doctor over here, and it's been one of the best decisions I've made, so no regrets at all. So that's a bit as to how I ended up in Australia, even though I was living in Canada. Now, if we compare and contrast the Canadian and Australian specialty programs, we can break it down into residency duration and competitiveness, working hours, pay, and lifestyle. So when we talk about residency duration, the way the Canadian residency programs differ from Australia is that when you're done med school in Canada, you enter a specialty program right away, and that's a certain duration, and then you're done. You're a fully qualified consultant. But in Australia, once you're done med school, you basically do these unaccredited junior years where you're in the hospitals doing rotations in different specialties. And the entire purpose of that in Australia is to get a bit of experience in different specialties and dabble a bit in a few different things before you really understand what you want to go into and before you really commit to one specialty. So the residency duration is a bit longer in Australia in comparison to Canada, where you make that decision at the end or by the end of med school, and then you're done. You basically enter and you get into it. And if we compare hurdles and big competitive hurdles with Canada and Australia, the roadblock in Canada is getting into med school and getting a specialty program, whereas in Australia, getting into med school is difficult, but the big hurdle is getting into a specialty program. That's the little funnel that people really struggle to get into in Australia, which is why they end up doing junior years and unaccredited registrar years for a very long period of time. So that's sort of the duration and competitiveness for both of them. That being said, with both countries, if you choose to be a GP, both countries are in dire need of GPs, and in comparison to specialty programs, or hospital especially programs, general practice is not as competitive and is fairly streamlined for both countries. So entering to be a GP is not as difficult as it is, say, being a orthopedic surgeon. Now, if we go to the work hours between the two countries, I don't really know what the Canadian legal standards for work are, but just from what I've seen and from what I've heard from my friends, Canadian doctors and Canadian junior doctors work far more longer hours than Australian doctors do. That being said, doctors in general just pull crazy hours no matter what country you're in. But if we were to compare the two, you know, 24-hour on-call is a thing in Canada, whereas it's not really a thing for junior doctors in Australia. We have like minimum blocks of shifts or like hours in a shift, whereas these hours are a bit longer for Canadian doctors. And I feel like we're a bit more supported and have a bit more structure with regards to the hierarchy in the Australian system, in terms of we have a junior doctor, we have a baby intern who's just a PGY1 who can escalate and stratify responsibility, whereas it seems a bit more full on for Canadian doctors that have just graduated. So those are sort of, you know, like working conditions and working hours between the two countries. And if we were to compare pay, Australian doctors get paid more when we're talking about junior doctors and doctors that have just finished med school. Canadian doctors make around, I need to pull up the number, around like 60 to 70,000 Canadian with no overtime. And the reason Australian doctors end up getting a bit more than Canadian doctors is through overtime. So our base is around 80 to 90, depending on what state you're in. But when I was in Queensland, my base was around $80,000 to $90,000, and we got paid overtime. So with the overtime, you make double your hourly rate, which just adds up to your salary. So you can just end up making a bit more in Australia in comparison to Canada. And if we were to talk about lifestyle, I definitely think Australia lets me have the lifestyle I love, which is just being active, having a bit more sunlight, being able to step out a bit longer and just more frequently without really worrying about bundling up, warming up, and worrying about snow. So I find that Australia is incredible just for amazing beaches, for a really active lifestyle, so you can distress after work. And I just felt that that wasn't the case in Canada, or it was a bit more difficult in Canada, where I was living in the West Coast, so it was very cold. The majority of the year was winter, and very, very cold winters. So becoming active or staying active was a big hurdle and challenge, and required a lot of motivation, which is something that I just didn't want to have or need. Now, if we talk about lifestyle, I definitely think Australia is the country for me and lets me have a lifestyle that works for me in terms of my career and also my personal life. So I'm very active. I love working out, being out in the sun and being active and being able to go out and about at any time. And the Australian weather and cities, just in general, let me do that, where I don't really need to care about if it's snowing or if it's super cold or if it's icy outside, etc. The weather conditions are normally fairly normal, where you can just step out or even just put on a sweater if it's winter and just leave the house and get a little walk in, or go to the beach, etc. So I find the country just really works for me with regards to my lifestyle. Now, Canada and Australia are very similar with regards to their cultures, the people that are in it. So there's no big difference with that. Everyone's really lovely. Everyone's very nice and welcoming. At least they have been to me. So there hasn't really been any difference from a cultural assimilation point of view. But it was just the lifestyle aspect that was a big factor that made me settle down in Australia, even though I was living in Canada for a good 10 years of my life. Now, I really hope this has helped. If you guys have any more questions, please comment below. I love the engagement that's happening on these videos. It makes me feel like I'm actually talking to someone and hopefully making a bit of a difference and helping you guys out. I want to be able to, you know, help as many people out, especially international medical graduates, to come into Australia and, you know, make a different life, and start a new life and a positive life for them. So please keep the questions coming. And if you like any of my content, please subscribe or please give a thumbs up. It just makes me a bit more motivated to continue making content. Thanks, guys.